We are now moving into our next section in terms of what's on the syllabus to talk about who is God. And of course, the first question we have to ask ourselves is how do we know God? And an ancillary question is can we know God? Um, Two interrelated questions because I do know in some sense as people of God we talk about knowing God. But when we do that, what do we really mean? How can we really say we know God? And how can we think about God in a systematic fashion? I would want to suggest, first of all, that God is a mystery. Now, what do I mean by mystery? Something that we may be able to participate in, but even in the participation in it, there's still an element of that mystery that we cannot know. So we talk about God as being, at least in the terms of the Latin, the mysterium tremendum. That is this tremendous mystery that attracts us and repels us, that we bow down to and worship, but also bow down to in awesome fear because of the great mysteriousness of this being called God. From First Corinthians second chapter, we get this from Paul, but we speak of God's wisdom, secret and hidden, which God created before the ages for our glory. The secretness of God, the hiddenness of God. How can we as human beings possibly know this? Paul goes on to say that through grace and through Jesus, we get to know this mysterious God. But for the purposes of the lecture this week, I'm going to do my best not to bring Jesus into the mix because we will be talking about Jesus later on in the term. I want us to truly focus on this being called God, this being that we have this name for, God. God is absolute. That is, we cannot think of anything greater than God. We can not think of anything higher than God. We cannot think of anything even lower than God or wide as God. God is so absolute that we cannot fathom the mystery of God. But God is also this mystery, this unknowable, this unknowing thing that we participate in. God, as a part of being this mystery, is transcendent. That is, God is far and beyond anything that we can even imagine or think of. God is so far above us. We get this from Paul again from Acts. For as I went through the city and looked, I found among them an altar with the inscription to an unknown God. This God who is so far removed from us, we don't even know him. We don't even know it. We don't even know her. Because God is just so awesomely deep, we cannot even find language to describe God. And this is a part of what we mean when we say that God is transcendent. God is beyond us as created beings. God is beyond us as human beings. So we don't know God. And again, in the beginning when God created, this simply means that when God created, there was nothing else. God is the creator. And how can the creature or the created being know fully the creator? So in a very real sense, we cannot know God because God is so far out there. God is so far beyond, we simply cannot know who this being is. But God is also immanent. That is, God is right here with us. God is near us. God is our breath. God is our life. God is our being. God is knowable in God's creation. So God is right here with us. From Job, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Does God have breath? This implies that God is so close to us that God can actually physically breathe into us. To do that, God has to have, metaphorically speaking, a mouth. God has to be able to physically put breath into our bodies. That they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. God is very near us. So we got these two competing ideas, I guess. God is transcendent. God is immanent. God as far away, but God as near. Simply means that God is paradoxical. What is a paradox? From the Webster's Dictionary, we get this idea of what a paradox is. One idea of what a paradox is: someone who does or can be two different things that seem to be opposite to each other, or who has qualities that appear to be opposite to each other. So God is far away, but yet God is near. God is paradoxical. God is a mystery. God is one that we are forever trying to know. God is beyond, but God is near. So how do we know this paradox? How can we, as thinking, sentient beings, know this paradox? This being who is far away but is yet near. How do we know this God? From John Calvin's Institute of the Christian Religion, he says that we can begin with God, that is to seek knowledge of God, or we can begin with ourselves. In either case, if we seek to know God, we will then know ourselves better. By the same token, if we seek to know ourselves better, by virtue of doing that, we get to know God better. And for John Calvin, he said it doesn't really matter where you start, because one is going to lead to the other. But John Calvin also said that even if we know something about God, this knowledge is tainted by our sin. So if we begin to think about knowing ourselves, that sin prevents us from knowing ourselves correctly and knowing God correctly. So what he suggests, and we could get into this not today but later on, he says that the only way that we can truly know God and ourselves is to use the spectacles of Scripture. That is, we can only know these things through this revelation of Scripture, how God reveals God's self through Scripture. And we learn more about God in doing it like that. From Migliore, we get this quote: Christian theology has to offer some account of the basis of the church's affirmation about God. This includes the question of the source of the knowledge believers claim to have about God. How do we know what we know about God? How do we know this? Only by God's revelation of God's self. Only by God doing it. We cannot know God of our own volition. We cannot know God of our own will. Because if we try to know God only by our own efforts, of necessity, our knowledge will fall short. So God reveals God's self to us. But in this revelation, there's still an hidden aspect of God. We might catch glimpses of God. We might catch a light of God. But even in this revelation, there is still that mystery that we cannot know. There is still this element of God that we cannot fathom. There is still the nature of God that we cannot quite grasp. So as God reveals God's self to us in Revelation, we know more, we know more, we know more. But in all of our knowing, we know less. Again, it's a paradox. A paradox that we go through, that we try and figure out in a lifelong process, quite frankly. This revelation of God, this knowing of God is objective on the one hand and also subjective. That is, we know God through objective means of observing the created order by looking at what God has created, seeing the elements of God in God's creation. But then there's this subjective experiential knowing of God. That is, how does how do I experience God? And this goes just beyond mere emotionalism, mere feelings. This a something that grabs us and will not let go of us. That helps us to know, in a very subjective, personal sense, that God is, and that helps us to recognize that my subjectivity, somehow this allows me to know the objective reality of God. God is not like a tree whereby I can go and touch the tree and feel the tree and feel the roughness of the bark, see the greenery of the leaves. Because God is spirit, we cannot fully know. We can't touch, we can't taste, we can't feel, but we know the reality is there. Again, these are all paradoxes of who God is. And then we have general and special knowledge of God. Again, to quote, to use John Calvin said that all human beings have some general knowledge of the deity. All of us have some general sense of who God is by virtue of us living and seeing the world. But this general sense of knowing God is hindered by our sinful state, is hindered by our sinful nature. And because that general sense is hindered by sin, we need some kind of special revelation of God. And John Calvin says, and other theologians will also say, that special revelation comes through Scripture, comes through what the Bible says about who God is. That is the only way that we can get this special revelation of God. What does the Bible say? How does the Bible describe God? What are the various attributes the Bible gives to God? So we need both general knowledge of God and we need special knowledge of God. But one seems to be greater than the other. What if God is black? Can we know God is black? Can we experience God as blackness? Huh. With James Cone and a Black Theology of Revelation, of liberation, um, he talks about the blackness of God and how this understanding of God goes counter to our traditional means, our traditional sense of talking about God. You got this quote from Robert Kennedy. Well, suppose God is black. What if we go to heaven and have treated the Negro as inferior, and God is there, and we get up there, and He's white. He's not white. What then is our response? What if God is black? Now I know we speak of God as spirit, but any culture, any people will talk about God in their own likeness. That is, we're going to give God what's called anthropomorphic attributes. We're going to humanize God. So let's think about, how do we humanize God? How have we humanized God? And quite frankly, in America, that way of humanizing God is primarily being as this white male. And what James Cone is doing in A Black Theology of Liberation is to challenge that perspective, to attack that perspective, because that perspective has been a way to oppress black people. So he boldly says God is black as a way of getting black theologians to talk about God from the black experience. So perhaps Cone is right. God is black. And I guess we have to consider, what does that mean to us as we talk about God? What does that mean to us as we think about God? Does that challenge our traditional perspective of who God is? That is, can black folk think and talk about God different than anyone else? Should we do that? Or should we all have a kumbaya moment and say God is the same for everybody? But if that is true, how then do we get these different experiences of God? Should we have these different experiences of God? Again, from Cone, the reality of God is presupposed in black theology. It's an attempt to analyze the nature of that reality, the reality of God, asking, what can we say about the nature of God in view of God's self-disclosure? That is, Cone recognizes that God is the one that discloses. God is the agent in doing this. We are the recipients of God's agency. So what do we do in view of God's self-disclosure in biblical history, that is, in that special revelation, and combining that with the oppressive condition of black people in America? How do black people talk about God systematically given that perspective? Should we talk about God differently given that perspective? How do we do that? It all boils down to this notion, be you black, white, man, woman. God meets us where we are. God meets us in our reality. Whatever we are doing at that moment, when God reveals God's self to us, that is our departure point in beginning the task of talking about God. And this goes beyond traditional language. It goes beyond doctrinal formulations. It goes beyond how the bishops may talk about God. It goes beyond how presiding elders may talk about God. It goes to, where does God meet you at in any given moment? And that's where we start talking about God. So read those chapters assigned from Migliore and from Cone for this week, and tease out how they, I guess I want to say, play with the notion of how do we know God, this mystery. How do we truly understand that? And continue to think about that in your own free time and as you go along in this term, because we're building now. We're building in terms of our own systematic thought. We're building from who we are as in a given place at a given time, talking about these different doctrines of the church, beginning here with God. All right, so that's where I'm going to end right now. That's long enough. I don't want to bore you too much, but of course you can view this as much as you want to. All right.